Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore another fairly dark topic, that of self-deception, which was suggested by a viewer who goes by the name of Struggler. So many thanks to you, Struggler, for suggesting that excellent topic. And so, without further ado, here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video. As usual, you can also find it in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. A few more seconds. Leave it up. Okay, let's get started. First, what do we mean by self-deception? Well, basically we're talking about how we so easily fool ourselves, especially by lying to ourselves, which actually we do quite a bit when you think about it. Of course, that implies that our subjective experience of things is not always straightforwardly and transparently self-consistent. True, sometimes we are that way, but a lot of the time we aren't. A lot of the time, we tell ourselves we believe or think or feel one thing when it's not even remotely close to being true. And if we have a capacity for self-perception, we're shocked when we discover that our actions are completely at odds with what we've been telling ourselves we believe and think. I suppose that at first all of that sounds like a formula for hypocrisy, and, well, perhaps it is. But it's also something very common and very human, and not necessarily anything shameful or pathological. Actually, it's nothing more than an integral part of human reality as we know it, and the fact is that very few of us are immune from it. However, not all of the lies we tell ourselves are created equal. In fact, they vary quite a bit with respect to the depth of our self-deception. For instance, sometimes when we're deceiving ourselves, we kind of know we're doing it, but we just want to go along with it anyhow. That happens especially when our self-deception gives us permission to act on our underlying desires. So, if we want to eat a big slab of Valentine's Day cake for breakfast, but the truth is that it will violate our diet, it suddenly becomes pretty easy to tell ourselves something like, well, just one piece won't hurt. And so in cases like that, we're usually dimly aware of our self-deception, and it's not too difficult to admit the fact that we're just fooling ourselves if we're motivated to do so. But then there are the other kinds of lies we tell ourselves, lies that are much more serious at a psychological level. And because they're more serious, they're also much harder for us to recognize and admit, mostly because we've repressed them so deeply that they simply seem like a part of reality itself. And here we're starting to enter the domain of the psychoanalytic unconscious. That is, the parts of ourselves we've repressed so thoroughly that we dare not recognize them, not even for a second. They are, as Jacques Lacan once poetically described it, the censored chapter of our lives, where we're so desperate to believe in our own self-deception that no amount of objective evidence or logical argumentation will convince us to do otherwise. And of course, this is also where our lives are most thoroughly affected and ruled by the lies we tell ourselves, precisely because, well, we simply regard them as reality. So, with that rough mapping of our self-deception in mind, let's explore our motivations. So, the question is, why do we feel the need to lie to ourselves? And probably the general answer is, to put it in the words of Jack Nicholson, because we can't handle the truth. And so, we lie to ourselves in order to keep from realizing the truths we can't handle. But what sort of truths are those? Well, they basically fall into two classes. Very dark and shameful truths on one hand, and somewhat surprisingly, very positive truths on the other. Let's look at the darker truths first. One big reason we lie to ourselves is to cover over the parts of ourselves we hate and wish weren't there. And especially truths that make us feel negative emotions like shame, anxiety, depression, and anger. We might be lying to ourselves about something we've experienced or done in the past, or it could be about how we are in the present, or it might be about what we're anticipating in the future, and probably most commonly it's a combination of those. But in one way or another, we lie to ourselves because of the unpleasantness of facing reality honestly and straightforwardly. Basically, because of our very human tendency to try to deny and escape psychologically from what we don't want to admit. We lie because we want to be a certain way, and the truth is that we aren't. And often, we use other people to aid and abet our self-deception. One way we do that is by employing what psychologists call projection, where we try to attribute the failings we hate in ourselves to other people. For example, a lot of insults work that way. When we want to insult someone, what we usually do is look within ourselves to see what would hurt us the most, and then apply whatever that is to someone else. So if what hurts the most is when other people think we're stupid, we're likely to employ a word like idiot whenever we want to hurt someone else. On the other hand, if sexuality is where we're vulnerable, we're more likely to use a variant of fuck. You probably get the picture. Anyhow, the point is that insults are almost always ways of trying to project our own vulnerabilities onto other people, which of course is a way of concealing them from ourselves. And the irony of insults is that they usually say a lot more about the person using them than about the person on the receiving end of them. However, another somewhat trickier way we use other people to aid and abet our self-deception is by convincing them of the lies we're actually telling to ourselves. That is, we often try to bolster our own lies by trying to get other people to believe in them too, which of course increases our confidence in the validity of our own self-deception. One easy place to notice this is on the internet. If you look at practically any comment or discussion board, odds are that you'll very quickly find someone desperately trying to assert his own moral and/or intellectual superiority over someone else. Usually by trying to win some sort of inane, trivial argument that no one actually cares about. So, why do we do so much of that, especially since it just needlessly generates a whole lot of useless emotional friction and heat? Well, the first thing to realize is that those kinds of disputes are almost never really about the actual details and validity of the arguments. What they're really about is trying to satisfy our psychological desires and needs by winning a debate, mostly by demonstrating to our opponent and to the audience of possible onlookers that our own position is the superior one, which of course implies that we ourselves are superior for espousing it. But of course, then the question becomes, why would that matter? Especially considering the fact that the internet is mostly full of anonymous people whom we'll never even come close to knowing in real life. Well, asserting our superiority becomes important when it's psychologically at issue for us, when it's indefinite or uncertain somehow, most likely at a pretty deep level where we can't even begin to admit it to ourselves. And if that were not the case, well then, we probably wouldn't feel much need to proclaim and defend our supposed superiority in the first place. In fact, we'd probably be spending our time and energy on something else. But perhaps the more important point here, besides illustrating some of the tricky dynamics of self-deception, is that when we see people desperately trying to assert their superiority in order to cover up or compensate for some sort of underlying deficit, it all of a sudden becomes a lot easier to treat them with kindness and with compassion for their suffering, rather than just blindly engaging in some ridiculous arm wrestling match that no one really gives a crap about. In fact, probably not even the antagonists themselves. But of all of the truths we can't handle, and all of the reasons we have to lie to ourselves, some of the most surprising ones have to do not with what is insecure and dark and broken in us, but with what's the exact opposite of that. And here I must acknowledge a personal debt to the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow, and most especially for his formulation of the Jonah Complex. Basically, the Jonah Complex is about how we actively avoid glimpsing and living toward what is best and brightest within ourselves. In other words, it's not only our darkness and shame and insecurities that overwhelm us, so much so that we have to turn our eyes away from them. Surprisingly, it's also the brilliance of our own inner fire. And there are several reasons for that. One is that there's usually a pretty weighty sense of responsibility that comes along with recognizing our talents, our gifts, and our powerful possibilities in this life. In other words, when we finally admit to ourselves that we are living bearers of something that is undeniably wondrous and miraculous in this universe, the question naturally becomes, well, what are we doing with that? Are we living in ways that are congruent with that reality? Or are we mostly selling out to our fears and insecurities and settling for something second-rate? And of course, the terrifying answer is that most of us squander a hell of a lot of time in this life on things that are light years away from what we really are underneath it all. And our fear of recognizing that horrifying reality, which essentially has to do with how we're wasting our possibilities and wasting our lives, naturally gives us a lot of motivation to keep deceiving ourselves, to keep reinventing the fiction that it couldn't really be true, that we couldn't possibly be bearers of all that is bold and brilliant and miraculous in this world. But we are, whether we like it or not. And yes, this means you who are watching this video right now in this exact moment of time. And probably you're seriously doubting everything I'm telling you. Well, God, I'm sorry, and I hate to be the one to tell you, but your entire existence, suspended like a fleeting moment in time in a universe without end, is already pregnant. Every drop of your blood and every breath moving through you is already pregnant with untold miracle, waiting for you to summon the courage to see it and live toward it. And like I said, I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry that you were born to this world in the tragic and funny way that you were. But it's really too late to bitch and whine about it. But maybe it's not too late to own it. Just a thought. Anyhow, beyond the weight of our fundamental existential responsibility, most of us harbor a deeply seated fear of being misunderstood and rejected by the people around us, most especially by our friends and families, the people we love and cherish the most. And the terrifying thing about our deeper possibilities and potentials is that if we were to start living toward them, the people in our world might not be able to understand or accept us. Our friends might decide that it's time to stop being our friends, and our significant others might decide to forsake us for someone else. And for most of us, that's once again a very powerful motivation to keep deceiving ourselves about our deeper possibilities in order to keep the risk of rejection at bay. But here I'd like to say that if your friends can't find it in themselves to let you change and grow, and if they can't accept your desire to realize what's deep and luminous inside of you, well, then they're probably not actually your friends in the first place, and never have been. In fact, probably the word for people like that in your world wouldn't be friends, but enemies. Because it's mostly your enemies in this world who would like to see you stay small and unfulfilled. Sure, their company might be pleasant and agreeable, and it might help you get through the day too. But that's not the same as being your friend, at least not in any genuine and deep way. That's because a real friend, or anyone who really loves you, is someone who really sees you deeply enough to accept and appreciate your faltering attempts to grow beyond yourself and to become whatever it is you can possibly be in this life. Your real friends and your real family love not only what you are, but what you might someday become. But, of course, that fact doesn't necessarily stop us from being afraid of losing the relationships we currently have, which, of course, once again gives us plenty of motivation to keep ourselves acceptable to the people in our lives, especially by lying to ourselves about our deeper possibilities, as well as about our hidden desires to fulfill them somehow. However, Beyond even the combined weight of our existential responsibility and our fear of being misunderstood and rejected by others, the biggest reason we keep lying to ourselves and indulging in our personal Jonah complexes has to do with our fear. Actually, terror is probably a better word, about being overwhelmed and annihilated by what lies deep within us. Simultaneously, the most horrific and the most exhilarating part of us. The deep, well-maintained secret of our divine inner fire. The part of us that extends even beyond the pale of everything we find dark and shameful about ourselves. And at first, that probably sounds a little ridiculous. After all, why should we fear being annihilated by our very positive potentials? But actually, it's not an unrealistic fear. The fact is that there's a distinct chance that fulfilling our latent potentials will annihilate our lives, at least as we've known them thus far. That's because what's deep inside of us is actually powerful enough to do that. Powerful enough to reconstellate our values, our habits, and the ways we perceive things and move from moment to moment. And if that were to happen, well, exactly who would we be then? Who would we be if we weren't defining ourselves moment by everything that hobbles and enslaves us, by all of our unwarranted and outmoded limiting beliefs about who and what we have to be? And what new values and involvements and ways of perceiving the world would we have to invent if someday the river of our inner possibilities were to carry us far, far beyond ourselves? It's an ecstatic question, that's true. But it's also a very terrifying one, and one that provides a particularly potent motivation to continue the charade of our self-deception so that our attention is always focused somewhere else. And hence, to keep skating around the truth of who and what we really are. So at this point, it's probably natural to ask how we ever manage to experience a moment of discontinuity that pushes us in the exact opposite direction, that interrupts the stream of lies we're telling ourselves and invites us into deep self-honesty. Basically, how do we ever make that sort of transition in our lives? Well, there are probably any number of possible answers to that question. Sometimes I think it happens when we just get sick and tired of lying to ourselves, definitively saturated with the stink of our deceptions and evasions, and all the broken promises we've made to our better destinies. And perhaps when we reach that moment of utter desolation, maybe when we're lying naked and shivering with the raging fever of our spiritual debilitation, it actually becomes preferable to look our inner darkness and our inner brilliance right in the face, despite all of our fears and insecurities and despite all of our good convincing reasons not to do it. To be direct and honest with ourselves after all of this time. Sometimes it happens that way. At other times, I suspect that it takes a real cataclysm in our lives to get us to question ourselves that deeply. Perhaps the death of someone close to us, as happened to me when my own brother died on my 24th birthday. And still other times, I think that it happens out of sheer frustration and rebellion, out of a kind of angry existential defiance where we simply refuse to continue living like cowards and slaves, and where we finally realize the truth of that old adage, better to die on your feet than live on your knees. However, my own experience in this world has taught me that it would be a complete illusion to think that those sorts of moments could somehow propel us into realizing the final, ultimate truth of our existence. The reason has to do with something I've experienced numerous times in my own life, and, well, maybe you have too. But let me pose it as a question. Have you ever had the experience of finally being honest with yourself about something, perhaps for one of the reasons we've just described, and at the same time recognized a far deeper truth within yourself, only to find out a few months later that what you thought was the final answer to the riddle of your life still contained a fair amount of distortion and self-deception, and that there's actually an even deeper form of truth beyond what you thought was the final answer. And then, a little while after that, having the experience where you realize that there's an even deeper truth yet, etc., etc., etc. Well, I know that I've personally experienced that sort of thing numerous times, often enough to make me think that within the larger arc of our lives, there's actually no such thing as our final lie or our final truth. There's only our next lie and our next truth, and that the tangled skein of our self-deception knows no definitive end. And that the fact that there's no final destination for us means that our lives are really, well, really an adventure without end. Consequently, I'd like to end this video by leaving you with the following thought. Maybe it's not so much a question of whether we can be honest with ourselves, but a question of how much more honest we can be. Because at the end of the day, all of our lies are suffused with truth, and all of our truths are suffused with lies. Well, at least that's how I'm seeing into things these days. But of course, your results may vary. Not valid in all states of being. Not sold in stores. And so I guess that the very last truth and the last lie I want to tell you today would be this. Thanks as always for watching. And as always, take care of your soul.